Good evening, it's November 20th, I'm Leandra Bernstein, and this is The World in Review. The fight taking place right now in Ireland as to whether they will sign away their hard-fought national sovereignty in order to bail out the bankrupt Inter-alfa group of banks should remind us what is at stake right now, not just for Ireland, but for every nation on the planet. What is taking place right now is the dangerous culmination of a process that began in 1971 when Richard Nixon ended the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system, virtually concurrent with Lord Jacob Rothschild's Inter-alfa group of international private banking interests stepping on the scene. Since that time, national currencies, which under a proper international system are regulated for the use of the nation, were allowed to float on the open market. And we all know what kinds of things float. And nations, their economies, and their leaders became increasingly subject to that empire. Today we're in a situation tantamount to war. This is what Lyndon LaRouche conveyed earlier tonight in his latest statement titled, "It is tantamount to war, sink the Inter-alfa group." There he defines the orientation for this coming period for either the survival of the sovereign nation state or an imperially motivated descent into a new dark age, and he puts out the call to all leading patriots of nations to fight. The beginning of his statement reads, "With the direct British strategic attack by the forces organized which have been rallied against Ireland under the flags of the banner of that British World Empire's Inter-alfa group, which was launched in mid-1971 to replace the world's fixed exchange rate system at that time, the fate of the world now hangs on the urgent need to rally the opposition to British imperialism, now to be found among the patriots of leading nations of the world. That, at a time while even the mere semblance of sovereignty still exists among the leading nations of the world at this juncture." This statement is now available in full on this website, and tomorrow it will be available as a leaflet for mass distribution at larouchepac.com/organize. Now, LaRouche goes on to make the point that the elimination of the Inter-alfa group does not mean we're going to eliminate banking institutions. Rather, what is becoming clearer every day is that only a Glass-Steagall separation of valid commercial banking assets from speculative debts is going to do a damn thing for any national economy. Take the case of Ireland, as Helga Zepp LaRouche presented it in her statement, "The Euro system has failed," posted on LaRouche PAC yesterday.
And it became crystal clear that what is at stake is not Ireland, Greece, Portugal and Spain, but it is the Inter-alfa banking system which is supposed to be bailed out. And the Irish government and the Irish population realized that because they don't own these banks, and why should they take the harsh austerity regime imposed by the EU when these banks are not their own banks, but they're really part of the British Inter-alfa construction. And if you look at the figures, it is quite amazing because Irish banks owe a total of 617 billion euro, 136 to Britain, 129 to Germany, and the GDP of Ireland was only 170 billion before the crisis. So, I mean, this is completely out of proportion. And, you know, if Ireland is forced to pay back this kind of money, it is worse than a Versailles regime, and it cannot function.
So you have a situation where the people of Ireland, and the case is similar for Spain and other nations in the EU, these people are now expected to pay private international banking debts that are 5 times greater than what they are able to produce as annual GDP. The option is clear. Either the empire bleeds the nations, and we head into a severe hyperinflation in that process, or we return to Glass-Steagall. Then we separate the trash from the legitimate debts that can be paid off under a renewed capital-intensive program of national economic development. Now, if you begin to take a closer look at the crisis in Ireland, you find that the pressure to take a bailout is for the sole purpose of bailing out the Inter-alfa group banks. In an op-ed in today's Daily Telegraph, it was noted that the reason European policymakers are forcing a bailout on a reluctant Brian Cohen in Ireland is not because Ireland has run out of money. In fact, their debt is fully funded until the middle of next year. What's really at stake, and the reason British Prime Minister David Cameron has been breathing down Cohen's neck, and the reason the troika of ECB, EU, IMF hitmen were sent into Dublin, is because the banks at stake in Ireland are predominantly Inter-alfa. Right now, the biggest Inter-alfa bank in Ireland, Allied Irish, announced losses of 13 billion euros this year and is counting on being taken over by the government for their survival. The concern now is if the empire's banks in Ireland go down, it will be a domino collapse that hits Britain next and the hardest. In the meantime, Ireland is virtually infested with Irish branches of Inter-alfa banks, including Allied Irish Bank, Bank of Scotland and their subsidiary Ulster Bank, Intesa Sanpaolo Bank, Commerce Bank Europe, and KBC Bank. Now today there was also a meeting of a different troika, this one not targeting Ireland but China. The meeting in Frankfurt earlier today was addressed by US Fed Chair Ben Bernanke, ECB head Jean-Claude Trichet, and IMF Director Dominique Strauss-Kahn. In that meeting, Ben Bernanke proudly defended quantitative easing too, and both he, Strauss-Kahn, and Trichet laid into China, sending the message that the problem was not the new round of $600 billion in money printing from the Fed, but China manipulating their currency. In other words, China refusing to cave in and wreck their economy for the temporary benefit and relief of the world monetarist empire. But we should cut to the more general message that is being delivered by the British Empire and their wet naps like Bernanke in the United States. The message is our survival as a monetary empire means that nations will no longer be allowed to exist except to serve the interests of the monetary empire. And if that means the death of the citizens of the nations, so be it. This is what just took place in Greece under the austerity conditions imposed by the EU. These will be the conditions in Ireland and any other nation who is not allowed under the EU framework to undergo an orderly Glass-Steagall reorganization. Now we can look a little closer to home. What you're seeing right now in the United States, with the collapse of city and state governments, the bankruptcies, mass layoffs, home foreclosures for the sake of the banks, it's the same thing. These are effects of the same attack that's being waged against China and Ireland, against the governments and the people by the same enemy. And it's time for Americans to wake up and view the fact that both we in the United States and the rest of the world are under the same yoke of an imperial monetary system. This point was made strongly by Lyndon LaRouche in Thursday's weekly report.
So you do not have a U.S. situation. You do not have what most people think or what the press is telling you. We have now a planned global operation orchestrated through a group of banks called the Inter-alfa Group, which is determined to gobble up Europe. Now, how are they going to gobble up Europe? It's all there now already. But most Americans pay no attention to these things, the very things that may determine the fate of their existence of our nation. What they're doing is they're proposing, they have a group of banks in these various countries, Portugal, Spain, Ireland, Britain itself, all the parts of the European continent. These banks are generally already hopelessly bankrupt, just like the Federal Reserve System's banks today in the United States. In which you have a worldwide system in many countries, especially in the transatlantic region, nations of the transatlantic region, including Brazil, their banking system is now hopelessly bankrupt. In Ireland, for example, you have two leading banks, which are private banks, but they're hopelessly bankrupt. Now, what's the scheme? The scheme by the European Union, which is the agency which is pushing this elimination of the nation state as an institution, replacing government by governance. And a foreign international power, a financial power, is to rule the world. And that's the crisis right now.
So that's the situation, and that's the crisis. And in LaRouche's recent statement, it's tantamount to war, he lays out the 6 immediate steps of economic reform to be undertaken now. But the first is the return to Glass-Steagall in name and in intention. And in short order, then a return to a world system based on a fixed exchange rate between nations, as Franklin Roosevelt intended with the Bretton Woods system. Now there's one final point to make before we end tonight. The idea that the Inter-alfa imperial monetarist system was the only world system that ever existed, and so it is now the system that we have to bail out and we have no other option, that's a lie. Go back to 1971, or go back even further to when Great Britain devalued the pound in 1967, which broke the Bretton Woods Agreement and created the initial shock to the system. What we had in place, though imperfectly, before the Inter-alfa group was created in 1971 was a fixed exchange rate system among nations which had the imprint of Franklin Roosevelt on it and the intention of the United States Glass-Steagall Law informing it. Today, no nation should forget that. As the assaults by the British Empire continue on the United States, on Ireland, and on other nations, our call to arms must be Glass-Steagall or die. That's all for your report tonight.